Hello there, 8th graders. I have a little video lesson here for you today to help you with the first section of Unit 3 on British policies and colonial resistance. And this is a review of the quiz review handout as well as for the first quiz in this unit. And basically, it was about how the colonial people, they didn't like it. My little Bitmoji down there. They didn't like those policies, and they started to resist the policies of the British. And so we're going to just briefly review some of those policies and then how the colonists resisted it. So the first one is really kind of the setting of this, and that's the 7 Years' War. In America, we call it the French and the Indian War, but its real name was the 7 Years' War. And basically, this was a war between the British and the French primarily. And in North America, it was really about who was going to control the colonies. There's a reason we speak English in the United States and not French as our native language. And that was determined in the French and Indian War when the French lost and the British won. And so most of colonial America was turned over to the British. And eventually later, they got even more land when they defeated the Spanish. So because of the 7 Years' War, the British got control of colonial America. But it was also very expensive, and it cost the British a lot of money to win us against the French. And so they wanted to find ways to try to raise money. So this is why they started setting up these policies. So one of the first policies the British made was called the Navigation Acts. Basically, the Navigation Act said that the colonists could trade with nobody except for England and using English ships. They wanted to make the colonial America reliant on the British. And so that's what it did. And they began enforcing it. Actually, it existed for a long time, but it was by the 1760s is when the British started to really enforce the Navigation Acts in order to try to get money back from the colonial people. They also started to put taxes on different products. One of the first British policies was the Sugar and Molasses Act. And this was the first law that the British passed to try to raise money directly from the colonies. The Navigation Act was really about shipping, which was to raise money, but this act was really to try to limit what the colonial people could profit from and also to make money. So it was a tax on sugar and molasses. Now, why would anybody care about molasses? Well, at the time, molasses was used, and this is what molasses looks like, and then it was sent to a distillery, and then it was made into rum. And the colonists actually made a lot of rum, especially in the New England areas of the colonies, and then they sold it for money. And by taxing molasses, it made it more expensive, which meant people couldn't make as much, which meant they had less money. So this was an example of one of the things that the British did. One of the other policies that was probably the most hated of all of the tax acts that the British imposed was known as the Stamp Act. And it was passed in 1765, and it was the first time that the tax was directly on pretty much every person in the colony. It wasn't just on the people who needed molasses for rum or for shipping. The Stamp Act was for pretty much anything, and it affected not just the people selling things, but even just everyday citizens. And the Stamp Act meant that you had to have one of these stamps put onto your different documents, whether or not it was a deed or a will, even newspapers or playing cards, all kinds of different things had to have a tax stamp put on. And of course, it was frustrating to the colonists. They didn't want to have to pay it. They were upset about it. And eventually they did have to repeal it. And we'll talk a little bit about why that was. But the Stamp Act was an example of one of these other policies that the British imposed. So one of the important people who starts to lead colonial resistance was a man named Patrick Henry. We know him famously for his line, "Give me liberty or give me death," but that actually came much later, as we were preparing for the Revolutionary War. But he first started with this resistance to the Stamp Act. And he was from Virginia, and he went to the House of Burgesses, which is the legislative branch of colonial Virginia. And he stood in front of the people there and said, you know what, we should not have to pay this stamp tax, and he resisted the Stamp Act, and he began saying that we should boycott all of the things coming in from England. And Patrick Henry started this process of the colonial people resisting the British rules. And because of what Patrick Henry did, a group of colonists, just everyday colonists, actually met in October of 1765, and they became known as the Stamp Act Congress. And they weren't an official part of the government, but they basically wrote a petition to the king and said, you know what, you're still our king, and yeah, we're still loyal, but we really don't think you have the authority to tax us. And this meant that between the Stamp Act Congress and colonial people actually threatening the stamp distributors, the people who had to put the stamps on the documents, they started going after them. And this started to kind of lead the colonial people to resist. A lawyer from Massachusetts named James Otis became famous for his line, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." And that phrase became the rallying cry of all of the people in colonial America, all the way to the Revolutionary War, who believed that what the British were doing was unfair. And the Stamp Act Congress was the first time that a group of colonists sort of got together to protest. This did not stop the British. Yes, they eventually had to repeal the Stamp Act because the people were attacking the stamp distributors, but it didn't mean the British stopped finding ways to control the colonial people. So one of their other policies is the Quartering Act, which basically said that the colonial governments had to find places to house British troops. Not really in people's homes, but in other buildings. Eventually, the Quartering Act was expanded, and it became even a bigger problem as they were being housed throughout the colonies. But it meant that there were more and more British troops coming to colonial America, and the colonists were not happy about that, and they were unhappy that they had to find quarters for these troops. One of the other groups that's going to emerge as a resistance movement was known as the Sons of Liberty. And it started in Boston. Boston, Massachusetts is sort of the center of a colonial fight. And this group, today, we kind of cherish them as the men who fought against the British. But quite honestly, at the time, they were kind of considered a terrorist group. They were a secret group of colonists. They were civil disobedience. They threatened people. They intimidated people. They destroyed British property. They did all kinds of things that at the time seemed pretty crazy. But now we look at the Sons of Liberty as sort of the beginning of our founding fathers and how the fight against the British started. It was really led by these two men, Sam Adams and John Hancock. They were both from Massachusetts, and there are lots of people in the Sons of Liberty, but they are going to begin kind of proposing ideas to the colonial people to resist what the British were doing. The British continued to put on policies, and one of the next ones that they imposed was called the Declaratory Act. And this was pretty much just in response to the actions that were being taken by the colonists. So basically, the Parliament got together and said, we're the British. We are stronger and we are bigger, and you are our colonies, and we're going to have none of it. And the Declaratory Act was basically them flexing their muscles at the colonies, saying, you know what, we have every right to tax you any way we want, and you can't stop us. And so that's what the Declaratory Act was about. This was followed by the Townshend Acts. Now, the Townshend Acts were really important as a British policy, because this was where they started to expand their taxation on a lot of different kinds of things. So the Townshend Acts was enacted in 1767, and it included things like glass, paper, paints, and tea, and a couple other products as well. And this was very unpopular like all of the British policies, but this also was very much disliked by the colonists. And the British started to send more and more troops to America to sort of force people to pay these taxes and not destroy property. This man here in the picture is John Dickinson, who we know in Pennsylvania because Dickinson College is named after him. But he was an example of one of the other founding fathers of America who tried to push for the boycotting of British goods. It's going to be one of the ways the colonists resist. And so a lot of the Townshend taxes had to be removed because basically people stopped buying British goods, which meant they weren't getting any taxes. The only exception, of course, is going to be tea. And we're going to come back to the tea tax here in a few minutes. So as I mentioned, one of the ways the colonial people really started to organize was through the boycotting of British goods. So in order to not support the taxes and not support the British, the colonists could just not buy British goods. Now, keep in mind that's really hard for the colonists because most of their products are coming from Great Britain. They don't have a lot of other support from other countries, and they don't have a lot of materials on their own. So it wasn't like they could just go to Walmart and not choose to buy British stuff and buy something else. They didn't have a lot to pick from at the time, but they still organized these boycotts to try to pressure the Parliament, which did eventually mean that some of the taxes were repealed. They also went after business leaders, merchants. So if a business person sold British goods, they would publish the name of it in the newspaper. They would harass them. They would damage. They would break windows. They were doing whatever they could to keep people from buying British goods. The Sons of Liberty, which we mentioned earlier, were one of the groups who really pushed for the boycott of British goods. They also went and tried to support the made in colonial America places. You know, they would go to the merchants and say, hey, if you're selling American made goods, then we're going to support you. And so they kind of used both sides of it to push against the taxes. One of the groups that also emerged in this boycott of a colonial resistance was Daughters of Liberty. This was basically the female version of the Sons of Liberty. And these were women who led boycotts. They organized the making of their own cloth, that they didn't have to buy British cloth. They even started to make their own tea when they no longer wanted to purchase British tea. And so the Daughters of Liberty were another group that led through their actions as resisting the British rules that were put in during this colonial time. And since mostly it was the women who were purchasing a lot of the goods, this was a way for them to support the boycotts. One of the ways in which the colonial people started to resist was going after British troops. And this is known as the Boston Massacre. And it occurred obviously in Boston. And it was mostly because the colonial people in Boston were very upset at how many troops were in Boston. They didn't like that the British continued to keep troops in the city. And so it really started with just some everyday citizens, colonists, who were upset with the British soldier who happened to be there, and they started throwing snowballs and other stuff at it. And then, of course, more British soldiers came, and then more colonists came. It really ended up being just sort of a riot in the streets. But the British soldiers have guns, and the colonists did not. So the soldiers opened fire on them, killing 5. And as you can see in the quote here, the Boston Massacre, it wasn't that the colonists were right and the soldiers were wrong. It was really just sort of an unfortunate situation. But it really made the colonists see that they could resist. Now they were going to take their lives in their own hands if they did this, but they realized that they were starting to get really frustrated and angry with what was happening in colonial America. And this was one way in which they started to think about resisting.